The views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station.
Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program. Insights deals with the issues affecting those in the community as well as Northeast Michigan and the state. And now, Insights into Northeast Michigan.
Hello everyone, welcome to Insights. I'm Lauren Mixon. Today I am here with Jillian Ferguson. She is the Sexual Assault Program Coordinator at Hope Shores Alliance. And today I'm going to be talking to her about human trafficking. Good morning, how are you, Jillian?
Good morning, I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking.
Good, we really appreciate you being here today. So we're just going to address the topic of human trafficking and how that relates to Northeast Michigan. So if you wouldn't mind just talking to me a little bit about human trafficking here, because there are different forms. What is human trafficking like here in Northeast Michigan?
Yeah, I think human trafficking is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds right now because it is a major topic that needs to be addressed. Especially with the Super Bowl approaching, we know that that's like a big hub for human trafficking. But I think it's important for people to realize that it is happening here in northern Michigan, and it is happening in Michigan. Big cities tend to be hubs, but there's definitely traffickers that are moving their victims through Alpena. And that looks like sex trafficking and sexual exploitation as well as labor trafficking.
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind going a little bit more into detail, you listed the different forms that are here in Northeast Michigan. What do those look like for victims?
Yeah, unfortunately, human trafficking is a really hard thing to nail down because it doesn't always look like what we think it does. We see those things shared on Facebook in terms of be aware of your surroundings. There's people at Walmart kidnapping people, or there's babies on the side of the road, and when someone stops to help, they're kidnapped. And that, not to say that that doesn't happen, but it doesn't always look that way. It can look like an abusive boyfriend that starts to coerce and manipulate and threaten and force a girlfriend into doing things that she's not comfortable with. It can be a mom kind of lending her daughter out in order to gain advantages or gifts or whatever that looks like. It can be blackmailing if someone gets some suggestive photos of somebody and starts to say, if you don't do this type of thing, I'm going to show this. And it just starts to escalate until it's something completely different. And unfortunately, perpetrators and traffickers are smart and they see what works and they evolve their tactics in order to trap their victims and coerce them into these sorts of situations. And so, yeah, it doesn't always look like someone's kidnapped from another country and brought here. It's happening, and in fact, people can still be living in their childhood home and be a survivor of trafficking because it can look like a relationship from someone on the outside. However, once you're in it and you just see how disgusting and unhealthy that, like the things that the trafficker is doing to that survivor.
Yeah, let's go into that in a little bit more detail. So you talked about how we don't always think of the situation as being something where it starts from home or it starts somewhere close by. We do typically think of it as being these situations where someone is brought in from an outsider or something of that nature. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that gets started and how a victim gets pulled in? Because sometimes they're probably in situations where initially maybe they didn't even think that they were in danger.
That's very true, yeah. It's a tactic of perpetrators and traffickers to look for vulnerabilities among their victims, right? And the unfortunate thing about that is that we're all vulnerable in different ways, and it's impossible to eliminate all of our vulnerabilities. And so victims of trafficking, it wasn't their fault that they had vulnerabilities. It only becomes an issue when a perpetrator or trafficker comes along, sees that, and starts to manipulate that for their own gain, personal gain. And so I kind of mentioned, it can be just you get into a relationship with someone and they start to push you to do things that you're not yet comfortable with, or they start to manipulate you. But it's not as obvious and in your face as you might think it is. It can be, you might think that it happens to everybody and it's normal and that kind of thing. But like I said, perpetrators are really cunning sometimes and they're really smart in the way that they approach it. It's kind of like the analogy, like a frog in a boiling pot. You know, if you just start right out and make someone do something they're not comfortable with, that's something different. But if you start to force them to do things little by whatever tactics, whether that's blackmail or manipulation or coercion, then a lot of the times people around them and themselves don't even realize how bad it's gotten until it's, you know, not too late, because it's never too late, but until it's gotten very dangerous and intense.
Absolutely. So just relating the topic back here to Northeast Michigan, where a lot of people are in those situations where they are being manipulated and they are vulnerable to the people who are subjecting them to those type of conditions. What are we doing to fix that problem, and what can we do to make victims feel safe instead of shutting them out? And can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of really listening to what those victims are saying and taking it at face value and doing something to change it?
Yeah, I'm so grateful that you talked about that. I think as a culture in Alpena, we're getting better about believing and supporting survivors, right? And I think that that's really at the crux and the center of this issue, because from the outside looking in, it looks like different things, and we try to make judgment calls about things we don't understand. So if you really reduce all of that down to simply believing a survivor when they say something's wrong with this, then that takes away half of the issue. So as a community, I think we're getting better about listening and believing survivors. But also, we have a responsibility in this fight. It really comes down to us as citizens of our community to know what human trafficking looks like, to identify the signs, and to say something about it. And the challenging thing is it's not just the traditional partners that are responsible for this. You know, when we're looking to fight crime, we often use law enforcement and prosecutors and community organizations, and they all play a major role in human trafficking, obviously. But it also falls to TSA workers at the airport and hotel managers and cashiers at stores. It has to be a community-wide effort, because human traffickers are slippery. They know that they can separate their victim from everything they've known, and if they keep them mobile and they keep them moving, then the reality is nobody looks at it long enough to identify it. So just as a community, knowing what human trafficking looks like, knowing the signs, reporting it when you see it, and then believing survivors and helping them get the resources that they really need to heal after something like this has happened to them.
Yes, that is definitely critical, and we definitely want to be advocates for the people in our community, and we want to watch out for those things. Thank you so much, Jillian, for being here. We'll be right back with more. Welcome back, everyone. We are here with Trooper Ashley Simpson discussing human trafficking today from the law enforcement standpoint. Thank you so much for being with us today, Trooper Simpson.
You're very welcome.
So I just want to know, from a law enforcement standpoint, what is human trafficking?
With human trafficking, a lot of it is thanks to the media and, you know, productions of movies and things like that. People believe it's just the acts of prostitution. However, human trafficking is actually broken down into 3 separate categories. You have the prostitution or the sex slave area of prostitution as it relates to juveniles, so under the age of 18, and then those that are adults incorporated into the sex trafficking aspects. So they're either there through force, fraud, or coercion. And the last part that people really don't know about for human trafficking is the labor force. So somebody being forced to conduct labor of some kind, whether it be restaurants, you know, field work, or even just household work, without being compensated for it. So just simply giving them a roof over their head is not enough compensation for the work that they're actually performing for those people.
So coming from an aspect, like you were discussing in entertainment, a lot of times we see the prostitution aspect of it and the sex trafficking aspect of it. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that and what it means in detail?
The sex trafficking aspect of it is broken down to where it's the juveniles, so anyone under the age of 18, and then the adults over the age of 18. This could be simply somebody being trafficked, such as they're told you're going to go to a hotel, you're going to meet this person, you're going to perform whatever acts are requested, and then you're going to bring me back the money. Or there's other aspects where they may even just prostitute themselves, and they conduct their own calendar and they make their own appointments.
So you were talking a little bit about how we see this in the media. and it is a very common thing that, you know, we turn on the TV, and I think it maybe has conditioned people to think that there's only one type of victim in these sex trafficking and human trafficking incidents. And a lot of times we think of those as just women, young women, maybe in urban areas. But can you break down to me a little bit more who all is, you know, potential to be a victim? Is it just women?
So with human trafficking, because there's the prostitution aspect and there's the labor traffic, basically anyone can be a victim. It doesn't matter your race, your nationality, your income level, any of those things. Everyone can fall on hard times, and they can see it as an easy way to make money through prostitution. Or it can simply be you've wound up in a different country than you originally planned. Either you were sent here by somebody else, or you came here thinking you were going to do well and it doesn't work out that way, so now you find yourself working for somebody and they're not paying you the wages. It could be somebody who is a juvenile. They get caught up in, they don't like their home life, they start talking to somebody online, and next thing you know, they're picking up and they're running away, or they're moving to a different town, and the things that they're promised, good wage, new car, new clothes, whatever it might be, really isn't there. So now they're kind of caught up in that whole human trafficking aspect, and they don't really know how to get out. So overall, there really isn't a specific, white female, black female, African American males, Mexican males. It doesn't even matter, what they look like. It could be anybody. It just depends on the circumstances they get caught up in.
Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about people kind of spreading out and going their separate ways, whether it's moving away from family or going to a new country. How do human trafficking incidents usually start? Because a lot of times we hear, a person went out to the store, or they were just away from family briefly and then they go missing, even when it's just locally. Can you talk to me a little bit about how these incidents start, whether locally or abroad?
A lot of times what happens is the person knows somebody who's in the human trafficking aspect. It may be that for the prostitution aspect, they see, a woman that's a family member, a friend of the family, a close friend of one of their friends, maybe an acquaintance, and they see that they have high dollar items, and they're going, well, you don't have, a full-time job, how did you get that? So they kind of get lured in by maybe the aspect of how much money they could potentially make. And when I say potentially, it doesn't always mean that they're going to make that amount. There may be other people taking cuts of that money, and they may only make a third of what they initially thought that they would. The other ways that these people kind of get drug into it is that they may be promised something. So let's say that there's a young female online, she's posted, she doesn't like her life, she hates what's going on in it, she needs a new beginning. Well, some traffickers may see that as an easy in. They may see it as, well, let's just start a conversation with her. Maybe I can get her to, be convinced that I can give her everything she wants in life. And now she's going to pick up and she's going to drive 4 hours south to, one of the bigger cities potentially, and start a new life here. And she'll automatically be my first, trafficking victim in that aspect.
So once a person is in the human trafficking realm, what is it like? Because a lot of times we get misinformation regarding what those situations are like. Can you tell me what you've seen as far as the people who are doing the work? What type of lifestyle are they living?
I don't have any personal information as it relates. I can just talk about the information that I've learned through all of my education. With that, victims of human trafficking, a lot of times they're told they're going to live, in nice houses, they're going to have nice things, and then when in reality they're traveling with just a purse or just a backpack full of belongings. They don't have these luxury items, this luxury jewelry, or these nice cars and things like that. So a lot of times they don't get that lifestyle that they initially thought. A number of these victims of human trafficking also become drug addicted. Sometimes the traffickers will use drugs to lure them in after a while, and then they'll also keep them kind of sedated with drugs to keep them from, fully being able to communicate with the outside world. They'll keep them kind of under the influence, because then now they're dependent on drugs, so they're dependent on that trafficker to keep that drug coming to them, or they're going to have to find their own way to supply that, which means then they're going to be out seeking drugs themselves.
Very detrimental.
It is.
What can we as community members do to spot this when it's happening, as well as prevent it and report it to law enforcement?
I think the best way to try and prevent this from coming to our community is just being aware of what's going on around you. If something looks odd or suspicious, or you see the same car at the same time of the month coming to a certain hotel or a certain cottage or something like that, start to really look at what's going on. Are there extra people showing up for short periods of time? Do you have workers that are only here for a certain amount of time and they're forced to work 12, 14, 16-hour days, and then they aren't necessarily paid a certain wage? And that one's a little harder to try to track, but you would kind of catch on to some of those things. Seeing large groups of women that are in a certain house may lead you to believe that those people are being prostituted out of that house. There's a lot of different clues, but I think the overall is if something looks wrong or suspicious, it's probably time to have somebody else look into it a little bit further.
Well, thank you so much, Trooper Simpson, for talking with me about this issue. It is something that is very important and becoming very prominent, so we definitely want to just let everyone know what's going on and how to be aware. Thank you so much. We'll be right back with more after the break. Welcome back, everyone. We are back in the studio with Jillian Ferguson, and Sarah Flick has joined us as well. She is our outreach and services advocate at Hope Shores Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk a little bit about what victims go through when they are subject to human trafficking. What does their life look like? I know it's not something that a lot of people could even fathom. So could you all try to paint a picture for us of what victims go through on a daily basis?
Well, I think that one of the main things in their lives is a lack of control. And that's one of the major signs to look out for, whether it's they're not allowed to speak for themselves, whether they're moved around a lot and don't know where they are, where in the country they are, the city, the state. They don't have the resources. They might not have their papers with them, their license with them. They might not have any control of money. They might not have any control of what they wear or when they're able to bathe or eat or anything like that. And I think another word we need to think about is just the word trauma. They're in very dangerous situations some of the time, and they are in situations that are abusive, and they're in these situations because of coercion and force. And so their lives don't resemble anything that gives them any sort of choice in the matter, and they go through a lot of things that it's more of a survival tactic to survive rather than daily choices that they're making.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that trauma piece, because I think that's really important. I think it's important to recognize that there's no right way to respond to trauma. So even if you think a survivor isn't responding or reacting the way you think they would if they had really been trafficked or whatever that phrase looks like, there's no right way to respond to trauma, and there's no normal reaction to trauma. Mm-hmm. So it's important just to believe, support, and validate survivors regardless of our own personal judgment. Mm-hmm.
And you talked a little bit about mobility. Let's just go back to that really briefly. What effect does that have on a victim? Just always being mobile, being moved from place to place, and that kind of represents, in a way, a lack of control. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that?
It can create disorientation if you don't know where you are and you don't have anyone around you that you can ask for help or trust. You don't know who to trust. You don't know who's in on it. Things like growing up in the Alpena area, I can tell you where the police post is, I can tell you where the hospital is, I can tell you where I need to go to ask for help. If you don't know where you are, you're not going to know where those resources are either.
Mm-hmm. So talk to me a little bit more about the community aspect and what it means to recognize those signs of someone who could potentially be a victim or of someone who is being taken advantage of, and what we as community members can do to mitigate that and help out our community members and say, hey, this isn't acceptable, and notify the correct people so that this isn't continuing to happen. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the major things that people need to understand, as Jillian said earlier, that human trafficking doesn't always have the same face, and so a lot of the signs can be different. One of the things that I did mention was disorientation. If you say, where are you, and they can't tell you, that's a major sign. their controllers and abusers might be not allowing them to speak. So if you are somewhere and they're ordering food, or if they happen to be in the hospital and they're not allowed to answer for themselves, if they don't want to tell you where they've been, where they're going, don't want to give you a lot of detail about their lives, those types of things. It's more of an indication that something's going on. You know, of course you can have bruises or physical signs, things like that. Sometimes if you know a person, say they haven't been removed from their area, but they get a random tattoo, sometimes that means that they have been branded by the person controlling them. That's a very common tactic. Students suddenly slipping in grades, lack of sleep, not showing up for things like sports or clubs that they normally are into. Not that that doesn't happen anyway, but you know, if there's different behavior along with that, that's suddenly a sign that their patterns have changed, and it is something to look into.
Can you all talk to us about who we notify and how we go about making sure that a stop is being put to these situations when we are noticing these signs?
Yeah, when we talk about that prevention piece, I think it's really important too that we're not focusing on reducing vulnerability so that we're not trafficked, but we're focusing instead on perpetrator accountability, and that when we see those things, we're notifying our police, and whether that's the Alpena Sheriff's Department or the Michigan State Police or the Alpena Police Department, we have a lot of those resources at our disposal. So it comes right back to that see something, say something, and really working to reduce the demand. I mean, it's a supply and demand issue, and so holding people who are demanding this type of traffic situation, holding them accountable and focusing instead of reducing our vulnerabilities, but instead of holding traffickers accountable, seeing something and prosecuting it to the full extent so that they can no longer, because repeat offenders are very real, and like I said before, traffickers can evolve, and so finding these new tactics and then purposefully and intentionally and proactively ending those tactics and holding them responsible, I think is really critical.
You talked a little bit about supply and demand. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and what it looks like? Because I think sometimes we overlook that aspect of it when we think of human trafficking, because a certain picture has been painted in our heads about what human trafficking is, and sometimes we hold the wrong people accountable, or we don't hold enough people accountable. Can you talk to me a little bit more about the supply and demand aspect?
One of the unique things about trafficking as a crime is that supply dynamic. So with drugs, you know, it has to be manufactured, and then if you lose, you know, 10,000 kilograms of cocaine or something, you owe someone for that, right? But the difficult thing about trafficking is there is an endless supply of victims, right? If a girl escapes, or if somebody recognizes the signs and pulls her out, you can just go and grab another one. And so the supply is always there. And the reason the supply is there is because there's people in our communities demanding it. There's a reason they're coming through Alpena, because there's people in our community who are asking for that and paying for that and using that. And so looking out, not only identifying the signs and helping survivors get out of those situations, but then following that up with, this was the person who was demanding those services, hold them accountable and pursue them to the full extent of the law.
Absolutely. Well, I just really want to thank you both again for being here. Thank you, Jillian. Thank you, Sarah. We definitely need to notify people that there are resources, and that if anyone is experiencing any of these signs and they're seeing it out in public, or they themselves are a victim, that they do have somewhere to turn.
Yeah, if you or someone you know is a victim or a survivor of human trafficking, please reach out to Hope Shores Alliance. We're there to provide resources and support. And if you see something suspicious, obviously contact your local law enforcement agency.
Well, thank you so much again. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Insights. I'm Lauren Mixon, and we hope to see you next time.
Insights into Northeast Michigan is produced by WBKB News. If you have any comments, suggestions, or topics you would like to see on a future show, please email WBKB News. This has been a production of Thunder Bay Broadcasting Corporation. All rights reserved.